As you may recall, for those of you who were here with us last year's lecture featured Dr. Yael, I never pronounced her name correctly, Sternhell, and she was asking the question, how do we know what we know about the Civil War? She answered that question by examining the creation of the official records that are the foundation of the writing of Civil War history. For this year's program, we want to look at the other end of the spectrum, the impact of recent and current events on the study of Civil War history today. What does and what should the study of the Civil War and Confederate history look like in the wake of Charleston and Charlottesville? Now, unless you've been living under a proverbial rock, you know that the murder of 9 African-American parishioners at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina in June of 2015, and the violence resulting from the Unite the Right rally at Charlottesville in August of 2017 have had a profound effect on the public perception of the Confederacy, especially Confederate symbols on the American commemorative landscape. Here in Richmond, the most obvious manifestation of this is the ongoing discussion of the Confederate statues on Monument Avenue. Now, as we all know, in the last 3 years, there's been a lot written and said about those monuments and about monuments in general. But our program tonight is not, and I must repeat, is not about the events that occurred in Charleston or in Charlottesville or about Confederate monuments and symbols. Instead, tonight we want to consider something that has not received a lot of attention in the midst of all the writing and all the talk about the impact of those places and events. What we want to talk about is the study of the Civil War, especially the Confederacy. How has and how should the events of the last several years affect the way people study and engage with the Civil War and the Confederacy? Many Americans, and indeed people beyond our borders, remain fascinated with the Confederacy, Confederate military leaders, soldiers, and the battles and campaigns they fought. Books and magazines on Confederate history remain popular. People still visit Civil War battlefields and are interested in the Confederate side of the story. If this is where the discussion about the, if this were a discussion about the events of Charleston and Charlottesville, or about public policy regarding the Confederacy, we would have enlisted a broad range of speakers to engage those issues. Because this is a program about how Americans study the Civil War and the Confederacy, we first considered a panel discussion featuring people representing several major aspects of Civil War study, publishers and editors of Civil War books, Park Service rangers and battlefield guides, museum people, yada, yada, yada. But large panels tend to result in superficial discussions. So instead, we decided to limit the panel to a couple of speakers whose knowledge and experience give them the depth and the breadth on the to probe these issues thoroughly and insightfully. Without a doubt, Dr. Gary Gallagher and Dr. Edward Ayers are those speakers. Not only are they respected scholars within the academic realm who have won prestigious teaching awards, but they are historians who have dedicated much of their careers to bridging the divide between the scholarly and popular study of the American Civil War and its legacies. Furthermore, as further longtime colleagues at the University of Virginia, Gary and Ed bring to any program a unique blend of friendly disagreement and mutual respect that makes a discussion between them both insightful and entertaining. We have been spoiled for the last 20 years to have both Gary and Ed close by, and they have been very generous in sharing their time and expertise with this museum and other institutions. As you may know, Gary recently retired from his post as professor of history and founding director of the University of Virginia's John L. Now III Center for Civil War History, and now lives in Southern California, where he is a fellow at the Huntington Library. He is back in Virginia this week for a retirement party, and we're very grateful to him for agreeing to come a bit early to participate in this program. Now, this answers the questions that some of you Bottimore Lecture veterans may have had about why we're holding the lecture in October instead of September. We were accommodating Gary. Gladly. So, as you know, Gary is best known as the author, editor, and co-editor of nearly 40 books about the American Civil War, particularly the campaigns, battles, and leaders of the Army of Northern Virginia and of the Lost Cause interpretation of Civil War history. Two of his books, Confederate War and the Union War, are influential studies of what the opposing sides in the Civil War fought to achieve. There is a whole list of his books and more about his biography actually in your program, so I encourage you to take a look. As I shared, he's also been editor of several things, and one of those is the founding editor of the University of North Carolina Press's enormously successful and award-winning Civil War America. He has been a regular columnist and contributor of 200 articles to nearly all the popular Civil War magazines. His lectures on the history of the American Civil War and on Lee's Army of Northern Virginia are part of the Teaching Company's Great Courses series. Yeah, they're doing you at 70% off right now, you know? Sign up. A prolific speaker, he travels the world sharing his insights. Now to Ed Ayers. Ed Ayers is the Tucker Boatwright Professor of the Humanities and President Emeritus of the University of Richmond. Previously, he was Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences and Professor of History at the University of Virginia. His latest book, The Thin Light of Freedom, The Civil War and Emancipation in the Heart of America, received the Lincoln Prize. That book and its award-winning companion volume, In the Presence of Mine Enemies, Civil War in the Heart of America, 1859 to 1863, are derived from his University of Virginia Valley of the Shadow project, which was and remains a pioneering and influential Civil War digital history project. During the recent Civil War sesquicentennial, Ed was the leading figure in the Future of Richmond's Past, an organization that created a series of events commemorating the Civil War and emancipation in Richmond, culminating in the highly successful 2015 Richmond's Journey. If somehow you have never heard him lecture, well, let's just say he does it with the fervor of Baptist preach. You may also know his voice from Backstory, the popular podcast, which, as I understand, has something like, 500,000 subscribers and like in the top 10 of this podcast. It's just really quite amazing. So he's always trying to reach new audiences. Like Gary, he's been a consultant and advisor to the National Park Service sites and has been engaged actively in Richmond area historical societies, libraries, and museums, including the American Civil War Museum, of which he is the founding board chairman. Among the many honors he has received is the National Humanities Medal from the President of the United States in 2013, quote, for making American history accessible to all Americans. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome to the stage Dr. Gary Gallagher and Dr. Edward Ayers.
There's no reason why I should be interested in the Civil War. I'm third generation Californian, born in Los Angeles. My father dragged us off to southern Colorado when I was pretty young, and I got interested in the Civil War by reading stuff. I bought a book when I was 10 called The American Heritage Picture History of the Civil War, which is still a wonderful book to get people interested. Got lost in the war immediately, had a wonderful grandmother who started buying me books for my birthdays and for Christmas every year, and eventually persuaded other people to do the same thing. And have just been, so I've been in a rut for a long time. This has been my rut. I turned 68 last week, and this has been my rut since I was 10. I had about 300 books on the Civil War when I was in high school. My high school history teacher, who was a Virginian from the Norfolk area, had me teach about the Civil War in Alamosa High School in Colorado. I came at it in the way that many people do. I was interested in battles and generals. I was especially interested in Confederates because my grandmother gave me Lee's Lieutenants and R.E. Lee by Douglas Southall Freeman when I was young. I read lots of Lost Cause books without knowing that they were Lost Cause books. They were books, and they were interesting, and I read them. And so I started with a pretty narrow and predictable view of the war. And the wonderful thing about the Civil War is that it's like Emerson's Oversoul. It's constantly expanding and encompasses almost everything. And I've spent 30 years teaching about it now. Lots of doctoral students, thousands of undergraduate students, and it's been the most wonderful thing to teach because no matter what you're interested in, there's something in the Civil War that will let you get into it and let you understand something about United States history better. The Civil War is the most important thing that's happened in United States history. It's not even close. You may have heard otherwise from someone. They're confused. This is it. The Civil War ties up loose ends from the Revolutionary and Constitutional issue, and then it sets the stage. It's impossible to understand the United States now or at any time since the Civil War if you don't come to terms with the Civil War. That's the real gift of having it as a field and teaching it and writing about it and speaking about it. It's a gift that gives endlessly.
And I can see that was a mistake. Because that's an inspiring and even heartwarming story.
I sense a butt coming.
So I grew up in East Tennessee, and I asked my grandfather one time why we never talked about the Civil War. He said, "Son, we shot each other." Then I went to Andrew Johnson Elementary School, which is also weird, and I couldn't have cared less about the Civil War or history all the way through college. I went to graduate school. I was going to sort of write something about American culture and stuff, and get up to New Haven, and people say, "Where are you from, anyway?" And suddenly I was interesting for the first time in my life. I had this accent that I've not lost. People still laugh at it, as you can hear. And so, but then I wrote my first book about crime and punishment in the American South. My whole point was to write history that included people who were otherwise in the history books. And it was sort of part of what was happening in the 70s when I was in graduate school. And then I wrote another book, a long one, that had absolutely nothing to do with the Civil War. By this time, I'd been a professor at UVA for 15 years. And I was teaching this class on the rise and fall of the slave South, which has the Civil War in the middle of it. But it slowly occurred to me that, if you're going to live your life in the 19th century American South, you might want to reckon with the central event that happened there. So I backed into the Civil War, and I came to it because if you want to write history that includes everybody, this was the place that was so heavily documented that there would be a way finally to look into lives that are otherwise not illuminated. And so that's where the Valley of the Shadow came from. Insane idea, putting every piece of information about every person who lived in a northern community and a southern community online, and then writing books about it. And I first met Gary in Richmond when we were both consultants for the Organization of American Historians and coming here to advise on the battlefields. And ever since then, there's been an unspoken acknowledgement between us that tonight would be a good time to do it. That Gary knows approximately 473 times as much about the Civil War as I do or ever will. So I came to it with the eyes of somebody who was discovering all the things that Gary knew when he was 14. And I reconciled myself that I'm never going to catch up. But what that means is that Gary read this last book and, helped me with the military history. I respect all that, but I got into it too late to really have the visceral feel for it that Gary does. So we're coming from different angles on it. And so I'm going to ask Gary questions. He's going to say things, and then I will either argue with him or ridicule him. So we'll see how that goes.
My heart soared tonight when I found that Ed was not going to have any kind of digital part of tonight, because usually it's impossible for Ed's a spectacular speaker. He doesn't need stuff to give a good talk, but he always has it, and I've observed over the years that it works about half the time when he has it, and half the time he doesn't, and then he just ends up giving his great talk anyway. And it's always seemed to me that why not just give the great talk? But here we are, and we're just... And
I was coming here tonight, and I said, it's going to be so great that Gary won't give me that BS about all the digital stuff, because I might show him 4 minutes into it. So this gives you a sense of our warm friendship and the sense of trust that I have in this guy, all of which he says is fair, but that doesn't make it any less hurtful here. My
main goal tonight is that you feel like you're in a safe space. That really is what's on my mind.
We've already failed.
Are you feeling safe?
Yeah,
is it okay?
No, I'm not.
Okay.
So in some ways, you answered the question more broadly about why should we care about the Civil War. And I have to admit that coming into it later and all during the last decade, I've seen that's true what you say. People care. It matters. If we know what's going on. But the Confederacy, it lost. Why should we care? Why should we keep poring over the Confederacy which was kind of a bump in the road for the United States, you know?
It's a very big bump in the road for the United States, and it's not just a failure, it's really the most spectacular failure in United States history, at least for the white population of the United States. It's a failure beyond measure. You lose a third of your military-age white men, and you lose the thing you went to war to protect. It's spectacular. We need to study the Confederacy because you can't study the Civil War without studying the Confederacy. You can't understand the progression.
Some people do.
Well, some people do a lot of things. I mean, some people watch soccer. People do all kinds of things I'll never understand. I used to worry about them. Why are they watching soccer? But I don't anymore. Joan says, just serenity, Gary, serenity. It doesn't come easily. But that's it. That's another thing that Ed does. He goes to another place. And you wonder why he's not in your place anymore, because you were just talking to him. You cannot come to terms with the Civil War or with United States history and the issues relating to the institution, the cluster of issues relating to the institution of slavery, most obviously its expansion as you get closer to the Civil War. I mean, the Confederacy is the exclamation point at the end of that, and embedded in this enormous upheaval that comes in the mid-19th century. The idea that, as some people say, I mean, I've read in the course of recent popular responses to Confederate monuments and so forth, we should just ignore the Confederacy. You cannot ignore the Confederacy if you want to understand the United States history. You just can't do it. And the thing about United States history, it has very hard edges in it, and there are edges we need to come to terms with. It has wonderful soaring moments, and it has very hard edges. But the idea of kind of excising the Civil War from our understanding, and with it the Confederacy, from our understanding of United States history just seems to me, I always have to pick my adjectives more, my modifiers more carefully than Ed does. I tend to not have as good a filter between my mouth and my brain as others. It's a wrong-headed approach, I think.
So what do we learn from studying the Confederacy so intently? It failed, okay. What else?
It did fail. It tells us that there are certain issues that will galvanize people to the degree that they will do things that they would not have otherwise done. Even unlikely people, as we look at them. You look at the Confederacy, how do we explain that a place where 70% of the people don't own any slaves go into the army in vast numbers as true I mean, most Confederate soldiers are true volunteers, just like United States soldiers during the Civil War. Both sides resorted to conscription, but the absolute majority of soldiers on both sides are true volunteers. How do you mobilize a citizenry like that to establish a slaveholding republic? It alerts us immediately to the fact that complexity has to be a word. We should write it down on a piece of paper whenever we're thinking about history, and put that piece of paper close to us and just remind ourselves. The two hardest things I've found over the years with students, and two of the most fun, are to try to get them to understand the difference between history and memory, and how they're related, and how sometimes they're not so related, and to get them to understand that however complicated they think something was, they want it. Damn it, what's the answer? Is it this or is it that? And in history, it's almost never this or that. It's complicated. And the Confederacy helps teach us that.
Is that an alarming lesson that it teaches, is that people can be mobilized around such a cause?
Well, I think people have been mobilized. People mobilize around all kinds of things. People are complicated. I mean, people come at the war and think that it's kind of the anti-slavery side versus the slavery side, and Ed and I both know, and I'm sure most of you know, that on the U.S. side it's much more complicated than that. There would be no war without the institution of slavery. People pretend that that's, no. Take slavery out of the picture, there's not secession in a Civil War, period, 100%, end of discussion, go watch soccer. But there's a difference between causation and motivation. And for causation, slavery is absolutely central. For motivation, on the United States side, much more complicated than that.
Well, how about the Confederate side, too? Because I have people come up to me all the time and say, no, we were my ancestors, not slaveholders.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I have letters, and they never mention slavery.
Right, they don't.
How do you reconcile? Because one of the things that you and I both say is that look at the record. right?
Yep.
Evidence is what historians do.
Yes.
Right? But the evidence of motivation of Confederate soldiers says nothing about slavery.
Doesn't have to say something about slavery because they are part of a slave-holding system. It would be like saying, getting up in the morning and when you log on to send your email, say, your first sentence is, gee, it's great to live in a capitalist society. Now, what are you up to? You don't need to say that. You're in a capitalist society. That's how it works. We all know that. When Confederate soldiers talk about their way of life, when they talk about our country, when they talk about, there are all kinds of phrases they use. Well, what they mean is they are part of a slaveholding society in which everyone had a stake. If you're white, it doesn't matter whether you own slaves or not. You have a stake in that society because right off the bat, it gives you a privileged status versus all people who are not white. I love it when people, I'm Irish, you might have guessed that from my last name. I love it when people prattle on about when the Irish became white. The Irish were white. Here's what you ask yourself about the 19th century. Could this person be enslaved? If that person could not be enslaved, then they're pretty much white. And if you could be enslaved, then we know you were not white. That gives you, and this isn't new with me, great historians have written about this for a long time, just by the fact of your being white, it gave you a superior status in antebellum Southern society. And there were also myriad reciprocal relationships between non-slaveholders and slaveholders that gave them a stake. And one of the biggest ones was race control. There are millions of African Americans living under slavery, and that scared white people in the South. They had the vision of San Domingue in their minds. They knew about Nat Turner. They knew about slave rumors. The institution of slavery controlled black people in a way that gave white people a sense of safety, or at least some sense of
So
safety.
they're more likely to actually write about race than they are about slavery in their letters, right?
Yes, they are. Much more. Much more. Much more.
So you mentioned Douglas Southall, a former rector of the University of
He
Richmond.
has big ties to this place, yes.
And people still love those accounts. How have our ideas about have scholars' ideas about the Confederacy changed since those books had such a big impact?
When Freeman wrote at what I think was, in many ways, the apogee of the power of the lost cause memory of the war, which is the former Confederates' memory of the war. There are different memories of the war. There's a Union cause memory of the war, an emancipation cause memory of the war, and a reconciliationist memory. The lost cause memory is the former Confederates' memory, and Freeman epitomized that, something I didn't know as a boy, but I mean, he had Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee is a perfect man in Douglas Southall Freeman.
And you remember how much, so these were written when?
His Lee biography came out in 34 and 35, and his Lee's Lieutenants, which I think is his best written work, came out from between 42 and 44.
And it's interesting to think about the distance in time between that and the Civil War. And
He was
between ourselves.
very close to the Civil War. There were a lot of Civil War veterans still alive. My father remembers Civil War veterans marching in the Rose Parade every year when he grew up in Los
And
Angeles.
it used to be something University of Richmond students would do for social service. They would go down to the home, which is now
R.E. Lee Camp number 1.
and talk with veterans. That was kind of their sense of how to give back to the community.
I think Freeman wrote at a time when certain assumptions were in place, and one of those assumptions was, from Freeman's perspective, certainly was that Lee was a great man, and the way you deal with the Confederate High Command is to treat them, for the most part, as sort of gallant warriors engaged in a great struggle against long odds, which are our main lost cause themes, and they're not all made up. There were long odds against the Confederacy, although I know none of you labors under the illusion that the Confederacy never could have won. That's one of the main lost cause arguments, that it's a hopeless fight against.
That doesn't make sense to me, Gary. Why would people celebrate something that never had a chance of winning?
Here's the problem. If you are a former Confederate and it's just post-Appomattox and you look back and think, that decision in 1861 doesn't look so good now. It's a risk to protect slavery in the long term, with an administration coming in that really was a threat to slavery. I mean, the Republicans did not want slavery to expand. They also didn't want it where it existed. So it is a threat. You took a gamble, and now, shattering defeat. How are you going to make sense of that and be able to look your children in the eye going forward, and their descendants in the eye? What do you do? Well, one thing you say is it's a war for high constitutional principle. They knew they were out of step with the Western world on slavery. And so it's not about slavery so much. It's about state rights and constitutional principles, and it's a war for that, and a war we never could have won anyway because the Yankees had too much of everything. Just look at them. Everybody knows. Everybody knows. Even Ed knew this as a 10-year-old. Robert E. Lee only had 11 men at Appomattox, and Grant had 100,000.
And entertainment.
And Lee's men only had 6 shoes, and 5 of them were left foot shoes. And yet he dragged the war out for 4 years. I mean, that sense, if it's a hopeless fight against enormous odds, but waged for high constitutional principle.
And the more irrational it was, the higher the principle.
The higher the principle. And yes, and I am not mocking this in any way. I'm saying that this is a way to come to terms with a catastrophic defeat, which has many people use World War I as the example of slaughter. I mean, it destroyed a generation of young European men, Germans and French and British. The Confederate loss was a higher percentage of its population than the British or the French or the Germans in World War I. It would be about 20 million dead now in the United States. It's staggering. That's one of the things they're coming to terms with, and the complete disorienting of their society.
So that was a great account of the lost cause, and as it was embodied in Douglas Southall Freeman. Our ideas have changed. We don't really want to do a forced march through all historiography, but kind of what have been the stages of Confederate history. And I will just see that you're going to be too modest, but Gary has played a dramatic role in reorienting everything about this. So I'll just alert you if you missed that. But go ahead and tell us how our opinions have changed.
Well, the big story is that it becomes a more complicated story with more kinds of actors in it. I mean, Douglas Southall Freeman's books are Confederate soldiers and their generals. And it's really the generals and the soldiers are there, this kind of noble army. Yes, and to be slaughtered in prodigious numbers. But it began with a handful of historians. A historian named Bell Wiley, who wrote in the 40s, brought common soldiers into the picture, and that has become a thriving part of what we do. We know an enormous amount about common soldiers now on both sides, which we didn't know before. Women came into the picture in ways that women were kind of off-stage support. They're Melanie Wilkes in the Lost Cause view, not Scarlett, because she's too selfish to care about anything, but Melanie actually does care and supports the Confederacy. That's the Confederate women. Are poor white women in the picture? Not really. We know that
they get those 3 days and they riot in Richmond.
That's it, and then they're gone. It's very much a bit role. So you bring a much broader part of Confederate and United States society into the picture, but we're talking about the Confederacy. You bring far more people in, and then you bring black people in. There are 3.5 million black people in the Confederacy, and they are all Southerners. That's why I always tell my students that Confederate and Southerner are not synonyms. Southerners are everybody who lives in the South, all 15 states in the South, 4 of which never left the United States. And 4 million of them are black people. Well, I can promise you right now, no black person got up in the morning and said, I just love being a Confederate. This is a high point in my life. I was okay before, but now I'm a Confederate and it's really good. No. They have been brought into the picture in a significant way as well. The enslaved people have, and given a much more active role in this very complex process of emancipation. So that's the main thing that's happened. It's gotten more complicated in ways.
Oh, that's just true. But when you say that there was a time we thought to be an honest historian of the Confederacy, you had to point to all its weaknesses.
Yes, absolutely, and really, okay. Now you're giving me a slow ball down the middle. Yeah. Yes, and emphasize the weaknesses. State rights was a weakness, not a strength, in the Confederacy. There was a famous book that they were. This is one of the great myths that somehow state rights was more powerful in the slaveholding states. State rights was available for everybody. That argument. There were no marches in the South against the Fugitive Slave Act. That was part of the Compromise of 1850. That's the federal government exercising power. Northern states responded to that by passing what were called personal liberty laws that tried to get in the way of the federal government enforcing the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. Anybody can call on state rights, but it's often the Confederacy is portrayed that way, when in fact the Confederacy became the most intrusive centralized state in American history by far. until deep into the 20th century. By far, the Confederate government did things that no other central government, including Abraham Lincoln's, did. It conscripted people. It impressed labor. It impressed crops. It just did things. It required travel passes. It did all kinds of things that were considered fundamental abridgments of individual freedoms and
yet,
liberties.
for a long time, historians were arguing that they didn't do enough.
Didn't do enough. Should have done more. Should have done way more. Why didn't they do more?
And so then the other argument's been that the Confederate generals were basically marching their men into death in an irrational, cultural,
really,
right?
Celts. They didn't paint their faces blue, but other than that, it was just like Braveheart and Mel Gibson. Just line them up and push them forward, and self-immolation seemed to be popular in the Confederacy.
Right. So, and then Gary published a book, The Confederate War, that pointed out, gee, I don't know, it looks like they fought for a very long time to me, and effectively, and mobilized every resource in their
Credible
society.
mobilization.
Yeah. So I think, really, we've never really seen the war the same way after Gary's book. It's like, even the people who want to emphasize the Confederacy's limitations have to acknowledge, no, they didn't give up. That they actually probably should have.
Much of the literature's emphasized class conflict in the Confederacy. There's always class conflict everywhere. And gendered controversy. The women gave up early and decided that it wasn't worth it. And of course, African Americans weren't on board. And as Ed said, they emphasized the weaknesses. But to me, the great problem at the heart of that interpretation is it's a war they continued until they killed 30% of all their white males. And no other part of America has ever come within a cannon shot of that kind of sacrifice of your population. How do you explain that? One of the arguments is it was never really a nation. They didn't think of themselves as a nation. I just think the evidence is overwhelmingly on the other side of that.
And Gary persuaded historians that that's the case. We kind of shifted the balance of gravity to figure out what's to explain. It's not why they gave up. In some ways, it's what would motivate them to fight.
Why they would go for so long.
So let me say something I've always thought, because I thought I'd wait till a lot of people watching to say it. You know, that you have married military history and all other kinds of history, but I think that one of your great contributions is to say, no, it was a war, and the military part actually is the spine of it all. Do you feel like most of us have gotten that message, or do you feel like you have to continue fighting?
Ed and I have talked about this over the years. I think that there are two worlds of interest in the Civil War. And one is our world of academia, in which there is very little interest in the military side of things, and in fact, a fair amount of outright hostility toward it, and a kind of dismissing it as simple-minded kind of history. But in the popular arena, most of the interest is driven by interest in battles and campaigns and famous lieutenants and the great operations that they waged. And to me, one of the main things I tried to do in my whole career was to show that either one of those doesn't give you a picture of the Civil War, because the connections are simply too profound. The military influences everything, political, social, emancipation in the military, just like this. Politics in the military, just like this. You can't separate them. They're all part of this very complicated mosaic. And if you don't try to come to terms with them, I think we're doing a little bit better job, to come back to your question yet, but I still think there's not much.
So why is it so hard from both sides? Why can we? Because you do read these Civil War magazines, and they are all military history.
They are.
And but you read the prize-winning books about the Civil War, they tend not to be.
Almost never.
So, but what's the? You're right. And I'm asking this because you do marry them, and I've tried in my own way.
You have? No.
But why are we talking past each other?
I think that there is. I'll just come back and say that I think there's a
leave soccer out of it this time.
I'm not going to. You know what? Now I'm going to mention soccer because you told me not to. I think that there is still a deep-seated, and contempt is too hard a word, but there's a strong dismissing and suspicion that if you're interested in military history, you're really a militarist. That kind of thing. Well, you want to study. And it's to the point, I've had 31 people write dissertations either under my supervision alone, or Ed and I have shared supervision. I've only allowed 2 of my students in 30 years to write on what I would call a real military topic, because they wouldn't get a job.
Box office poison.
That's right. I wouldn't let them do it, even though I think it's really important. But for their own good, I said, your second book can be, once you have tenure, you can do anything you want. Really, wear a tank top to work every day and write about generals all the time. But if you want to get a job, there's enough opposition still, I think, that would.
So where do you think the action is in Civil War history now?
I think the action in Civil War history now is on what I would, a good deal of it is on what I would call the Dark War, and that is the level of suffering and veterans who suffered long-term problems from the war. A guerrilla war has been increasingly popular over the last few years, to the point where some historians have argued it's the real action in the military side is the guerrilla war. That's a hallucination. There are maybe 50,000 guerrillas, and there are 3 million men in conventional armies. The conventional armies are what decide the Civil War. That's an old story, but it happens to be true.
So all of this is still an avoidance of the classic history that Douglas Southall Freeman and Shelby Foote.
Yep.
Right? And so in some ways we working hard not to retell those stories.
Yes.
Yeah.
Part of the problem with being a Civil War historian is that some really good people have written about it for a long time. And so if you're going to write about Gettysburg and you've read Bruce Catton, the odds are you're not going to write about it in a more engaging way than Bruce Catton did. So what are you going to do? One thing to do is say, that's been done. Let's do something else.
And as far, there's only been 54,000 books written about the Civil
That's
War.
right.
We've clearly...
Yep, just watch and why there have been 9 biographies of Sherman in the last 16 or 17
It
years.
suggests we're not very good, wouldn't it? And that we can't kind of nail it.
I think what it suggests is that it doesn't matter if there have been 8 biographies of Sherman if you've never read one. And then another one comes out, that's your biography of Sherman. I mean, that's what's really going on. We think, well, there have been 8. And somebody else might say, well, I only know about 1. And that's the one I read, and I liked it. And the newest Grant book, that guy also wrote about Hamilton and wrote about Washington. Maybe Grant will end up on Broadway. Grant, the musical.
So, you talked before about how African Americans did not wake up and say, I'm glad to be in the Confederacy. But as you know, some people have argued that they were.
In Gods and Generals, there's a great scene where Stonewall Jackson's talking to his prospective cook, and they're both from Lexington. And they both decide, well, we're both from Lexington, we're kind of in this together. And then they look at this post-war world that's going to be sort of cool for both of them. And I mean, that one almost, my head it rarely explodes. It came close to exploding. I mean, that one.
Yeah, but there's a more entrenched belief that African Americans really did support.
I know that, Ed.
I know you know that, but I'm just as people in the room. And
there's also, there's an argument that, and I don't, all of this. There's a Groundhog Day character to some of this. I have 2 files in my filing cabinet at home. One is of neo-Confederate hate mail, that is mail from neo-Confederates who hate me, and then one of people who call me a neo-Confederate. I hate you because you're a neo-Confederate. I hate you because you're an academic communist. I have these 2 files like that.
There is a complex individual.
Yes, I'm a complex academic communist neo-Confederate. I have my Confederate tattoos on this arm and my commie tattoos on this arm. But there's this sense that there's a desperate effort, I think, in some ways, to get the Confederacy right on slavery. And you cannot get the Confederacy right on slavery from our perspective. And part of that is this argument that there were thousands of black Confederate soldiers. There weren't. There were thousands of black men with Confederate armies. They were enslaved men, for the most part, with Confederate armies who were assigned that duty. And they have not been written about. That's one of the parts of the war that has not been written about. R.E. Lee's army, as it marched north toward Gettysburg, had thousands of black men marching with it. Enslaved men who did all kinds of non-combatant things with the army. Does that mean that no black man ever picked up a musket and fired at a Yankee? Of course it doesn't in a conflict this size. But this idea, I've seen a number as high as 50,000, 100,000 black men in the Confederate Army. It's not. Even though you have this incredible moment at the end of the war where the Confederacy seriously debates whether to arm some enslaved men in order to win the war. If that doesn't suggest there's a sense of national identity working, nothing does. And Lee supported it. That's part of Lee's national view of the war. Yes, arm some. Not because Lee was a kind of closet abolitionist, which he absolutely was not. He had very conventional views on slavery for someone of his background. But he said, look, if we don't do this, we're going to lose the war for sure. And the Yankees will set the agenda in terms of race relations, who votes, who doesn't. But if we win the war by arming some black men, we'll keep a much broader measure of control over everything else. So it's a very pragmatic decision on his part. But I think that the whole black Confederate thing is part of this effort to get the Civil War, get the Confederacy right on slavery. One thing that was...
About what you mean, say what you mean, what that means.
Oh,
you have to be right about slavery.
Oh, no, that slavery wasn't central to the Confederacy. It just happened to be this Confederacy had many attributes, and one of them happened to be that it was a slaveholding society. No, just read. I love to have students, I pick two witnesses at random, the president and vice president of the Confederacy. And I give them Alexander Stephens's Cornerstone Speech, which says slavery is the cornerstone of what we're doing. It's the reason we're doing this. It's the only reason we're different from everyone else and why we're superior. And Jefferson Davis's message to Congress in April, where he said we were forced to this because what was at threat was thousands of millions of dollars in property. That's his phrase. Our friend, the 1860 census, tells us that the property in slaves were worth $3 billion. All manufacturing, all railroads put together in the whole nation, valued at $2.2 billion. So the people who controlled the most wealth, by far, were slaveholders. The two wealthiest states per capita, white population in 1860, South Carolina, number 1, Mississippi, number 2. Only two states with an absolute majority of enslaved people. So there is a great deal at stake.
So, if I can sort of return to...
I know I've wandered.
No, that's all great.
Okay. I wish I had something up here on the screen.
It probably be broken.
That was mean and gratuitous.
Really?
So it really was.
So how about this then?
Yeah, how about this, Colorado boy?
But really, if those are the big issues, okay, that you talked about, why does it matter about the flanking maneuver at Chancellorsville or whatever? I mean, isn't there kind of a disconnect between significance of the kind of details of military history and these big structural and motivational things?
I think what someone else could say, well, who cares what the corn production in Fluvanna County was? What does that have to do with anything in the world that matters? Here's what matters. Chancellorsville matters because, and the flank march at Chancellorsville matters, it ripples out in a big way. The victory at Chancellorsville absolutely solidified, in my view, the position of Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia as the most important national institution in the Confederacy. And it raises Lee to a position where he functions very like George Washington in the Revolution. He and his army, Confederates looked to them to see whether the war could still be won. Not to Congress. Congress is a mess in the Confederacy. It's like the Continental Congress. It could be anywhere. Maybe it's in Lancaster. Maybe it's in Philadelphia. Who the hell knows where it is? But are Washington and his army still in the field? The battles matter. The Battle of Atlanta matters. And Sheridan in the Shenandoah matters, and the details of those battles matter because they re-elect Abraham Lincoln and keep emancipation on the table.
So, I walked right into the Chancellorsville thing.
You did.
But I'm glad you did Sheridan in the Valley, since I've written about that.
That's in your bailiwick. That's a slow ball back.
I appreciate it. But here's the thing. There are lots of military history that doesn't have those roots.
Of course there are.
Right?
Yes.
And it's still important for us to know that.
No, I don't think it's important for everybody to know every battle detail about the Civil War. What I think is important for them to know is that if you don't understand the military ebb and flow, you cannot possibly understand why the Civil War played out the way it did, why emancipation took the road that it did. Here's the deal. If there is no United States Army in the neighborhood, there is no emancipation. Not maybe, period. I don't care how much Congress and Lincoln and abolitionists in the North want slavery to end, or how much enslaved people desire, crave freedom. If you're in the middle of Alabama, an enslaved person in the middle of Alabama, and there's no United States military force anywhere near you, you are not going to be freed anytime soon.
Or even in the Shenandoah Valley.
Or the Valley. No, no.
It's there's no army until 1864.
64.
So this close.
That's right. So here's the number. I mean, a number to remember is there 3.5 million enslaved people in the Confederacy. At the time of Appomattox, 1/7 of them had been freed. And that's the number I'll take from the Freedom Project at Maryland. It's as good a number as any. 500,000 had been freed or had achieved their freedom. 3 million were still enslaved at the end of the Civil War.
So, Christy had said that, and we'll be turning to Q&A soon, so be ready, everybody. Had said that we're not really talking about Charleston and Charlottesville tonight. I guess I would be curious, and we won't, but I'm curious about, do you think that those of us who study this for a living, have our ideas been changed by seeing, or are there new responsibilities that we have after having these events? Those of us who write about this?
Well, I think it's, these Confederate monuments have percolated up as hot issues for most of my life. I went to graduate school at the University of Texas, and there are a number of Confederate monuments, or were, on the campus at the University of Texas. And they would come up, and there would be a debate about them, and then it would simmer down. I think what Charleston and Charlottesville did was bring that debate up to a level where it changed the terms of that debate. And it became a debate that engaged a far higher proportion of the population in the United States. And it did that, I think, because in the end, much of this debate, in my view, and I'm not speaking for Ed or Christy or anyone else, has nothing to do with the Confederacy or Confederate monuments. It has to do with current politics. And people chose their sides that way, I think, and have used the monuments as a way to get into other kinds of debates.
On both sides.
Oh, no, absolutely. No, yes, I think they have. I think that
people have hidden behind the statues.
Have hidden behind the statues and used them politically, which isn't to say that there aren't people genuinely concerned about them. There are. But I think that is a dimension that hasn't been present in the past, and I think the reason it reached that point is because of Charleston and Charlottesville. That's what I think really.
So do you think this will change the way we write Civil War history?
I think that it's, I work, both Ed and I work with a lot of high school teachers every year, and it has reached the point where some of the high school teachers have told me that in their schools they are not going to teach the Civil War anymore because it's considered too controversial, which I find heartbreaking and stupid, to use a word that is hurtful. But the idea that you wouldn't teach the Civil War because it's, but anyway, so yes, I absolutely think it's having an impact.
So in the same way that one time my mother-in-law introduced me to some friends, she says, Ed's a Civil War buff. And I said, well, a buff is somebody who has another job. This is all I
That's right.
But,
my first ex-mother-in-law told somebody once, Gary's a doctor, but not a real doctor.
Well, he'll get sick around it, right?
Yeah, don't show him your finger if it's bent.
So there's been, if you study the Civil War, that's a little suspect. Then you study the Confederacy within the Civil War, then you're really suspect.
I think if I had new graduate students coming along, I've had a number of graduate students communicate with me. They're afraid to write about the Confederacy. They think if they write about the Confederacy, they won't get a job. For years I said you can't write about the military history of the Civil War, but now they're thinking maybe we shouldn't even write about the Confederacy, or someone will say, well, why would you write about the Confederacy if you didn't sort of secretly like the Confederacy?
Yeah. So it's complex, and this would be my final question. And it strikes me that, and our new friends have heard this to some extent tonight. It strikes me that you are the historian of common sense and of the champion of the typical, right?
That doesn't offend me. I do believe in common sense.
And as a result, you're impatient with anything that is looks trendy or self-indulgent and all that sort of stuff. And so the question in there is, why?
Well, you've just amused some in the audience.
Yes. But you pride yourself on...
I do. I don't let my graduate students use buzzwords because it puts a timestamp on what they're writing. That's so 1970s. Which is really a mean thing to say to somebody. You were alive in the 70s. Look at an old picture of the pants you wore in the 70s. It makes you really regret things.
So the trick is...
I'm sorry.
The trick is to constantly view these things with a fresh eye. Right?
Absolutely.
And at the same time, to not succumb to the latest fashion.
I think, yes. And part of that is... In our search to find something fresh to say, I love it when we say fresh things. The temptation is to say the fresh things are really the most important thing, and often they're not. Often they're adding texture to something else we already know a lot about, and just say, great job, you've made me think about that differently than I did before. And I'll use Guerrilla War as an example. We didn't know as much about Guerrilla War as we should know. We know about John Singleton Mosby and maybe the stuff going on in Missouri with Quantrill and so forth. But so now we know a lot more about about the guerrilla side of the war. But then to take the next step and say, this is what really is important
and the
about
people who wrote before were really just myopic.
They were just all reading Douglas Southall Freeman and thinking generals mattered, but it's really the guerrillas that matter. That bothers me.
So I want everybody to know what bothers Gary. I have a
list on the back of your